path to accessing our, let's say, hidden human potential isn't really about chasing the latest modern efficiency hacks. Instead, it suggests returning to these comprehensive, time-tested systems found in ancient wisdom. It draws quite heavily on core principles from, mindfulness, Stoicism, and also specific indigenous traditions, treating them not just as historical artifacts, but as active technologies for living.
Right, and the results presented are, they're compelling. The practices the material lays out, things like breath work, rigorous journaling, that intentional connection with nature, they are undeniably effective tools, especially for managing the complexity, the emotional exhaustion of contemporary life. They seem to offer this tangible relief from what the source calls the quiet famine of meaning that seems to plague so many modern individuals.
And that relief, that's exactly what brings us to our central question for today. Is the true, the transformative and lasting power of these self-improvement practices, their ability to fundamentally change who we are, is that inherently dependent on their origin, on being part of those holistic, integrated, ancient wisdom frameworks? Does real success require adopting the full philosophical scaffolding, the view that sees mind, body, and spirit as, one complete system?
Well, I get the opposing view here. I'd argue that the profound effectiveness of these practices is actually entirely explained by empirically verifiable universal mechanisms, things like neuroplasticity, nervous system regulation, attention training. They are fundamentally robust, secular, psychological, and physiological techniques. Their power, I believe, is independent of their historical context. Their success really lies in how they work, not necessarily where they came from.
Okay. Then I will argue that it's only the comprehensive philosophical framework of ancient wisdom that provides the necessary context for integration, for purpose, and ultimately for the kind of enduring transformation that the material promises. Without that deeper why, these powerful techniques, they just become another series of isolated habits, probably doomed to fail eventually. The material, I think, makes a compelling case that we are suffering because we're constantly consuming more than we become. Modern life offers hacks, shortcuts, quick fixes, but it sort of fails to deliver what the text calls the blueprints for being human. The real strength of these ancient paths, mindfulness, stoicism, nature connection, is their absolute commitment to integration. They don't just offer a technique. They offer a whole way of life, viewing the mind, body, and spirit as this one integrated technology.
And this is exactly why the philosophical scaffolding is so crucial. Consider the Stoic practice of inspecting your day. It's not just about logging events, right? It's about aligning values with action. Marcus Aurelius wasn't merely ticking off a to-do list. He was reinforcing his identity as a virtuous agent in the world. This framework, it transforms our deepest limitations, the anxiety, the lack of focus, from being a permanent identity, I am anxious, into just weather, passing states that can be witnessed. And that witnessing, that philosophical distance, that's the prerequisite for clarity under pressure and what the text calls soft strength. Hidden potential activates, not through just one habit, but when the whole inner climate stabilizes. And that requires the consistent application of a system that's actually designed for internal meaning.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that holistic integration. Because, yes, the failure of many modern self-help systems is fragmentation. I grant you that. However, I come at it from a different perspective entirely. I think the integration happens through the repetition and the mechanism itself, regardless of the philosophical label we put on it. The efficacy of these methods, as I said, is best explained by the material's own summary of why these work. These principles, attention is trainable, physiology leads psychology, and repetition rewires. These are essentially universal laws of learning and nervous system regulation. They're biological facts. When we use specific techniques, like the simple counting of exhales to 10 to anchor attention, or that brief, sharp shock of cold water for maybe 30 to 60 seconds, we are exploiting these facts. The cold water, for instance, it triggers a measurable activation of the vagus nerve, which, regulates heart rate and prepares the body to handle stress. This is neurophysiology in action, plain and simple. The success stories cited in the material, like better sleep, finishing complex projects, those are the direct result of applying systematic effort and creating boundaries. It just confirms that mechanistic rule: small, daily consistency beats rare intensity. And that holds true whether the practitioner is seeking Stoic virtue or just wants a functioning nervous system.
But I think we fundamentally diverge on the necessity of that philosophical lens, especially when addressing the illusion of limitation. You focus on the mechanism, the attention training, the breath counting. Okay. But the ancient framework provides what I see as the essential precondition for lasting change, that shift from identification with the limitation to witnessing it. If I simply tell someone, okay, count your breaths, and they stop the moment their mind wanders, feeling like a failure, well, they haven't really achieved much, have they? But if I introduce the core Buddhist concept of non-identification, the idea that the thought, the fear, the limitation is just a passing pattern and not the core self, that philosophical understanding is actually what enables them to return to the breath kindly, 99 times out of 100 if needed. That foundational shift, achieving what the material calls clarity under pressure, that requires, I think, a deep understanding of the nature of mind itself. The practice is the mechanism, yes, I agree. But the philosophical framing is like the software that allows that mechanism to produce systemic transformation rather than just momentary calm.
That's an interesting point, focusing on the internal mental shift. Though I would argue that many modern, purely secular psychological interventions achieve that exact same shift. They just use defined cognitive techniques. Take the core Stoic practice you referenced earlier, the two-column control versus not control exercise. This is a really powerful, self-contained cognitive reframing technique. We don't necessarily need the entire philosophical edifice of Stoicism, the deep history of Hellenistic philosophy, to understand the pragmatic truth here. Focusing energy only on what we can influence is behaviorally liberating. When action follows clearly defined values, which you can define secularly, the outcome the material describes happens. Motivation stops being a gatekeeper because the system starts running on internal momentum and behavioral cues, not just fleeting feelings.
The journaling, the reframing, the prioritizing, these are essentially systematic cognitive behavioral tools. The practice itself, the simple act of sorting the world into those two columns, that provides the psychological transformation by shifting focus and prioritizing action, irrespective, I'd argue, of the deep historical lineage. In fact, relying purely on the mechanism might make it more accessible and perhaps less prone to sort of esoteric interpretation.
But isn't it true that accessibility often leads to fragmentation? And that fragmentation is precisely what this ancient wisdom seems to reject so strongly. The material heavily emphasizes the non-fragmented nature of these systems, that technology of mind, body, and spirit. If we reduce everything down to just cognitive reframing or, vagus nerve activation, we risk missing the profound effect of true integration. Look at the indigenous tradition practice mentioned. Meet the sun for 10 to 15 minutes with no phone. Okay, you could simply call this chronobiology, getting light exposure to regulate your circadian rhythm, sure. But the text clearly elevates it beyond that. It frames it as an